Hi, I'm Phil Odense. I run the Black Duck Audit Group at Synopsys. We were part of the company Black Duck before we sold to Synopsys, and we've been performing audits on primarily in the context of mergers and acquisitions for more than 15 years. And so the by the numbers is largely going to be informed by what we've learned over the years from audits and from collecting data on the specifics of what we find out in audits about technology companies that we've been examining primarily on behalf of acquirers. So if you look at the sort of the big picture of tech due diligence, we could go very broadly and look at due diligence first. But if we narrow that down to the technology considerations, they're really a stack of issues or a hierarchy of issues around the technology. So at the highest level, it's the product and the strategy. How does it fit? How competitive is it in the market? Is there a roadmap that makes sense and will be a winning strategy into the future? And then at the lowest level, we're really talking about the code. So if you work your way down through that hierarchy, you've got product and strategy, as we said, and then the people and the organization that are producing the software. At the middle layer there, you have the process and the tools being used by those people to create software. And the last two boxes really are the software itself, and two different views of it. The higher level view being the architecture and the design, and then the lower level view being the code itself, the source code and different elements of the source code. So there are risk considerations all up and down. The focus today is going to be on the code and essentially the bottom half here, the bottom couple of boxes. And then within that, looking at three different dimensions of risk, being legal risk, security risk, and then finally quality risk. So I'm going to walk through each of those in order and how it makes sense to think about them in the context of technology due diligence. So first, as background to get into the legal issues, the legal issues really have to do with licensing and licensing of code that's included, third-party code included within an application. To understand that, we have to step back for a moment and look at how code is being built today. And it's much more about assembly than writing lines of code. If we were to turn back the clock a few decades, just about every piece of software started with a blank screen and somebody typing the first line of code. But today, the complexity of applications is sufficient, and as well, the amount of software available for reuse is sufficiently plentiful that most code today is assembled. So it's assembled from a variety of sources. Those sources could be other parties, other commercial third parties who would license the code in. They could be code that was used on some other project within an organization. They might be legacy code inherited from a previous acquisition. It could be code that's outsourced to a team of developers offshore somewhere. And then increasingly, open source. So there are literally millions of open source components freely available on the internet. And increasingly over the years, and I'll talk about how increasingly in a moment, developers have been going to open source as kind of the go-to to find pieces of the code that will help them build up and assemble, as I said, an application. The little nuance here is all those other sources that I mentioned, again, outsourcing, previous projects, code, library from another party, also use open source. They've been built in the same way. And so developers today are using open source directly, and for other pieces of code that they're using open source indirectly because it was used to build that code. And what that nets out to is that of all the code bases we looked at in 2020, 75%. So, and it's been over 70% for the last couple of years. 75% of the code we looked at was open source. And that's risen pretty dramatically in the 5 years that we've been tracking this closely, from about 36% when we started to more than double that today. And it can only go so far. So it's not gonna go over 100%. And this is, I should say, this is all a good thing in evaluating an investment. You want to see that development organizations are taking advantage of tried and true components as they build their application, and using 50 or 60 or 75% third-party code, open source code in their application allows them to focus limited resources on the rest of the application, the other 25% that makes is the secret sauce that makes their company special. So with that in mind, that's all good, but it does raise legal questions. And so very quick copyright law 101. Copyright law applies to a software, and is essentially what it says is, if you are using somebody else's software in some way, you need a license to do so. And the risk of not doing so is the potential of getting sued, the potential of losing IP, just dealing with any issues that are raised, and that being causing distraction, impacting reputation, and likely at best resulting in a bunch of work that needs to be done for remediation. And I will say, open source licenses, just like open source code, just like any other code, requires a license, and open source licenses are enforceable and all that. And so what we find, again, looking back to 2020, about 2/3 of the code bases we looked at were using code in a way that was inconsistent with the terms of the license. And that's a problem, and typically acquirers want to avoid that. Also, about 1/4 of the code bases we looked at had code with no license at all. So we could identify the code, we could identify where it came from on the internet, but there was no clear license either in the code or next to the code, or terms of service on the site that would indicate the copyright holder's intention for that code. And most attorneys would say that's a risky proposition. Whoops, excuse that. So that's kind of full stop. High level. We could talk about licenses all day, but that's the concern in investing in a company where software is a big part of the valuation. You want to make sure that software is properly allowed to be used under proper licenses. So moving then on to the next area of concern, it's security, and this is an area that seems to be growing over the last, let's call it 5 years or so. And this is just a collection of articles from, every few months, somebody writes an article in the trade press that says cybersecurity is becoming more and more of an issue in M&A. And not surprising, this is the Forrester quote, has nothing to do with M&A per se, but it says 31% of companies have been hacked. And so if we sort of extend that would say that's because there's some problems with the code or their cyber setup, and big companies are likely to be better at guarding the gates of the castle than will smaller companies. It also relates back to the open source discussion, with 70% of the code being open source. That's a lot of open source components, and open source components, just like any other code, can contain vulnerabilities. And so we find that a vast majority, 84% of the code bases we looked at, had open source components with known vulnerabilities, and 60% with high risk vulnerabilities, which you can probably guess what that means. And in virtually all cases, these vulnerabilities have been discovered, announced, publicized, and that rarely happens without a fix being available. And so with respect to the open source issues, it's more indicative of companies not managing their open source very well, not updating it when they should, rather than any inherent problems in open source. So the last area I'll talk about is quality. And it's a little, the risk is a little different in kind than the previous two. So legal issues, you might get sued. Security issues, you might get breached. Quality issues are a little more certain. If the code is not of high quality, either in terms of its structure or its architecture or the code itself, that's going to be a drag on future development. And so just real quickly, I'll cite the architectural, some observations about architecture. Well-designed code with a healthy architecture is going to be, the developers working on that code will be highly productive. And the stats here say 80% on offense and 20% on defense, meaning 80% of the energy of the development team is going into adding new functionality, and only 20% to fix things that they break in the course of doing that, introducing bugs. And it's flipped on its ear for a poor design. And these are real stats about real code bases, that in a poorly designed or poorly architected code base, the development team may be only 30% on offense. So 30% of their time's adding cool new stuff into the software, and they're spending more than twice that much time, 70%, on fixing problems that are introduced, because everything's connected to everything. What you want is a nice hierarchy, modular pieces. So if you fix something over here, if you add something new over here, it only impacts over here. But in a poorly designed code base with everything connected to everything, if you change something, you're likely to break something else in another part of the code. And so as an investor, you want to understand, is this code going to be easy to maintain going forward, or is it a problem? And if it's a problem, that doesn't mean the deal's off. It just may need to get built into the going forward plan, to the 100-day plan after close. So how do you manage it given this environment where all software can have legal issues, security issues, or quality issues? Well, I guess the main thing is you want to understand that going in, and that's what due diligence is for. And you can get a certain amount of insight into that by asking for disclosures, by having discussions, by talking to the senior technical people. But take it as with a grain of salt from a vendor of code audits. The rubber really meets the road in the code. And so certainly if any concerns come up through disclosures and discussion, it's worth having a third party audit the code. And why a third party? Because typically targets would not be comfortable sharing their code with a potential acquirer. And most potential acquirers are uncomfortable with that as well. So if there are issues, they can be addressed in the deal terms. Perhaps rep and warranty insurance can help plug the hole. But as an acquirer is always in a better position in dealing with issues they know rather than unknowns. And as I kind of alluded to, at minimum, you want to plan for remediating over time, and with private equity buyers ultimately having their eye on divestiture. It's good to be thinking about it. So on the divesting side, hopefully this stuff's been figured out, on the front end, dealt with as part of the acquisition, and if not, could be remediated through best practices being put in place while a firm is in the portfolio. And we've certainly seen companies where they suspected they had issues, bringing us in proactively to help look into the code prior to real due diligence with an acquirer, and that's a reasonable way to get a good night's sleep before due diligence starts. So we're available anytime for questions and answers, but we also have some great pieces of collateral, an ebook, a slightly condensed version of that, and a white paper talking about this due diligence, this tech due diligence framework that I've talked about. We have a checklist, which is the best we've been able to find, and we've gotten some great feedback on, that goes into details in each of these areas and kind of how to evaluate it, how to interpret the results, and why it's important. And then finally, I've been kind of rattling off a bunch of statistics, particularly about open source, and those are covered in this open source security and risk analysis report. We do have advisors available as well, who talk to folks every day about their software due diligence strategies. We're happy to chat with you about that. And I think I've overrun my 15 minutes here by 37 seconds. So thank you for your patience, and hope we'll be hearing from you.